All right. Welcome back to the Elite Performance Podcast, and we are here back with round 5 of our movement meetup talk with my good friends, Shawn, Tyler, and Korey. Fellas, how you doing?
Good.
Dream
Awesome.
living.
Yeah, doing wonderful this morning. A little snow in the background, so things are good.
Yep, Shawn said dream living, but I think he's lying a little bit as we talked off.
This is the
February,
time.
17th, and we snow every goddamn day.
Yeah.
In the Midwest, it's horrible.
This is the time.
You know that
where you're
living,
like,
that dream living is a fake it till you make it type of thing. So much like I live each and every day of my life, I'm just going to keep faking it as much as I can and hope that I end up where I'm supposed to be.
Beautiful.
Yeah, this is the. I think Korey's going on that path, but the weekly conversations with the wife, like, you know what, we should probably move somewhere south.
Warm sounds great.
But perfect. All right, so we're gonna dive in today. Some application for hopefully some of our listeners that how we're trying to apply some of the concepts in maybe our off season, whether it be with football. I know some of us will probably specifically talk about football, but other sports as well, to try to give our listeners some how our brains work to how we're going to apply some of these concepts we talked about in the previous 4 episodes with our athletes. So I guess I'll just run down. Like I said, I have a whole list, a page full of ideas that I've gone through with my athletes and just share, and then everyone can kind of branch off.
Real quick.
Sorry, Korey, what?
Can you guys hear that at all? My wife's doing some stuff. Okay.
Nope. No, we're good.
I just want to make sure it wasn't like a dog bark in the background where it's like, so you might have to cut this part, but.
No, you're fine.
I
don't know how to edit video, Korey, so this is staying in. All right, so I guess I'll start just going down.
Real stuff right here.
Exactly, unscripted. So first of all, I'm just going to use a lot of different differential learning concepts with my football guys, specifically with catches. Trying to force my athletes to do, even if it's like one-handed or sliding or diving catches, trying to throw a bunch of different differential learning concepts specifically towards my tight ends and receivers in terms of catching. For a lot of my college and NFL guys, I asked them to bring back full pads, so helmet, shoulder pads as much as possible to keep that kind of that specific environment that they're going to be playing in as much as possible, practicing that, because there's a huge change from going just with no equipment, just putting a helmet on when it comes to your kind of field of vision, how you're going to catch the ball, all that kind of stuff. So full pads as much as possible. I'm going to force a lot of my athletes into exploration movement. So I'm going to force them into, again, maybe this might be a differential learning concept, into spin moves, hurdles, stiff arms in kind of an open environment where I'm trying to expand their movement toolbox or just expose them to some of these exploration movement concepts. Within a lot of our tasks and environments that we'll create, I always want to have like a first down marker, have like a down and distance in a specific part of the field that our athletes are exposed to, rather than just here's the task. I want some sort of a concept for them, because down and distance, hash to hash, 3x1 formations, 2x2 formations will all dictate, how guys play certain situations. I want to keep that information as much as possible. We do a lot of one-on-ones, half skelly type things. I want to include a lot of scramble drills. So if a guy doesn't get open, the drill is not over. We're going to the quarterback. I instruct the quarterback to scramble. Obviously, Shawn's arch nemesis for his guys, Aaron Rodgers, was a master at the scramble drill. I think it's a really a trainable type of a task. I think we, in practices, a lot of times if a play breaks down, they blow the whistle, the play's over. When in reality is in games, if a quarterback can get out of the pocket, those scramble drills are huge plays for both offense and defense of teams there in that regard.
So
work on special teams with my guys. Again, special teams is something that isn't targeted or hit up a lot in practice. So trying to do a lot of repetitions with special team specific positions with our guys. Breakaway concepts. So a guy, gets through a line, whether it be a running back or a tight end breaks a tackle, and now all of a sudden they have a big play potential. Again, that's how can an offensive guy score, and how can a defensive guy maybe prevent a guy from scoring? So different breakaway concepts, whether they're trying to split two defenders, or they have a guy tracking them down, or maybe they have a offensive guy out in front as a lead blocker. How can they use that lead blocker in this kind of explosive play situation? So trying to build in some of these breakaway concepts. Screen plays. I had a number of film things with my running backs and tight ends and receivers where, they have a screen type of play in space with one or two lead blockers in front of them. How can they navigate that environment and situation? Let's see here. Scoop and score situations with defensive guys. And then the last thing would be a lot of challenge catches with my receivers and tight ends. In college and in the NFL, every catch is basically challenged. Like there's always a guy dragging on you, hitting your arm. It's, a lot of times guys practice just catching with nobody on them. There's no sense of urgency. So making sure every one of our catches is challenged. There's a guy ripping the ball out or hanging on the jersey and things like that. So those are just a rough list. I skipped a couple things, but that's just a rough list to give a concept for you guys, how maybe my thought process going through for our offseason and our listeners, how we'll apply some of those things to our athletes. But whoever wants to go from here and maybe build off those or add on to what you guys will be doing, obviously, with your athletes.
That's beautiful, Michael. I appreciate you giving those. I was obviously, if the listeners saw me turning my head, if it was coming to my screen at all, I was obviously writing down some of those awesome concepts there. So I appreciate you sharing for sure. I know for me, if we would have had this conversation back about a year and a half, maybe even close to 2 years ago, I think we probably all, but specifically myself, would have needed probably about 2 hours worth of things that I was going to start changing within my approach to creating these learning situations for the athletes. So I'm happy to share some of those major ones that I changed back about 2 years ago, if time allows today. But I'll kind of give a short list of some things that I'd like to add in to some of the learning strategies for this coming off season. And this is specifically for football, and I can mention some for lacrosse and maybe even a few for baseball or basketball here later on. But for me, allowing the athletes to be even more involved, and I don't want to make it sound like I haven't allowed them to be involved before, but what I mean by that is them giving me even more suggestions on what they feel through the dialogue and interactions that we have had throughout our practice sessions of what they feel they need work on, and starting to interleave those into our sessions versus it being something that I have seen them do and or not do and want to include in the sessions. So me specifically for this one is allowing them to be even more involved with that learning system. Another big one for me, which I started just this year, is making the representative task or keeping the representative tasks even closer to the off season than I used to. And so I didn't have a hard set like 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever it may be, because every athlete's coming in at different times, that I started utilizing even more representative tasks to make sure that those information movement couplings were even tighter. But for this year, I'm going to bump it up a little bit, probably 2 to 3 weeks, where I'm adding in more representative type learning a little earlier in the off season. And there's two reasons for that. Number one being the fact that I want to get even better myself at constraining to a forward. That way they're interacting with the information very, very similar to the information they're going to perceive in the environment, in hopes for even better transfer whenever we evaluate film and their productivity. From a movement standpoint, later on, stats would be great too, but from a movement standpoint. And secondarily, I'm finding that it's almost like some of these representative tasks have become even novel for some, just simply because, as you guys well know, there's so many out there that are not even utilizing representative learning whatsoever. They're doing drills and they're doing change of direction speed. And so if I'm getting guys and I have a very shortened window, or if I have an even a longer window and I haven't worked with them before, I want to layer in as many representative learning opportunities as possible for them. And that's not to say I'm not going to use novel tasks at all. It's just that I'm finding that I'm not getting as much time to work with them in the representative learning as I'd like. So that's a big, big one for me, is bringing it a little closer to the stages of earlier off season. Adding in more and this kind of goes along with that one, adding in more 2v2 plus problems, and for some, I should say, to layer in complexity within the problem to be solved. Something that I have done honestly in the past, because I didn't have 4, 5, 6 guys out there all the time, is I had a lot of 1v1, 2v1 type scenarios. And those you can obviously build in plenty of complexity and speeds and constraint manipulation within those, but being even more deliberate about having 4 to 5 out there. That way I can create even more in-depth problems. Something I mentioned this on Twitter or one social media site earlier in the year is documenting all the interactions that I have with the performers in these learning concepts versus it being I just try to remember from time to time. And I've done that a little bit over the years, but really being more deliberate about that this particular off season. I just started it last off season. Within mirroring, we've talked about before on the podcast. The question I think you actually asked me, Korey, is what's the lowest I would go, or the most basic concept of perception action, intention action coupling I would go. Mirroring being the lowest for me, but being more or paying more attention and being more mindful of not having an offensive guy that's going to be elusive essentially in a situation, doing really any form of mirroring, maybe outside of the first week or two, they come back and they're seeing me, unless they're on special teams. So not just doing mirroring for the sake of doing mirroring. If I have an offensive guy who's never going to be mirroring an opponent on the field, if they aren't on special teams and needing to make a tackle, is being more mindful for that within my learning strategies that I create and build for these learners. Being more deliberate with this. Yes.
So yeah, like I sometimes have the same thoughts with like guys who are mostly elusive offensive players, but I guess what enters my mind is what if they need to block?
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and I've had that happen where I was not having one of my receivers do a lot of mirroring, and then he mentioned to me that about half of his ability to earn a paycheck is him having to block. Yeah. So I do think there is reason for it, and I do it some. Yep. But I'm not going to have it as much in there as I used to, simply because I think me personally, I was gravitating towards about half of my time being spent towards a variety of different mirroring situations or mirroring problems. And the mirroring problem that they were having, like I was trying to build complexity within, like just say a lateral mirroring, for example, and then they might accelerate out of a lateral mirroring, or they might have to go into a different variety of mirroring from a lateral mirroring. So within I need to block, or there was an interception or situations in a game where they might have to, I won't give a particular percentage to it, but that's a great point. So that's the reason, that's personally the reason why I still have it in there. Gotcha. I just am not going to have it as much as I used to.
Gotcha. Okay.
And I won't keep going on mine except for one or two more, then let you guys jump in. One thing I started last off season, and this actually I got from Shawn, was inviting, let's call it important people to the sessions. That way we create different levels of pressure and anxiety to see how their behavioral dynamics change throughout those sessions to help with adaptability. That way, they have that stability within their movements, but they can withstand or they can handle those perturbations within their particular movement strategies. Surface changes even more than I've done before. And then last but not least, within the problems we're designing, having more pursuit from behind. That's something, and not to give him all the credit here. He's sitting on the call, but when I was reading the blog Football Behind the Stats, it was like that Shawn had written, like having pursuit from behind. It's like, oh my gosh, like I do tons from the side, I do tons from the front, I do tons when they can't see but they have to hear it and feel it. But I haven't done a ton from whenever they're having problems in front of them to solve, and then they have pursuit from behind. So those are just a short list for me for football, like this off season, that I will either add in even more so, reduce a little bit, but still have there, i.e. the mirroring, or just things that I haven't done previously that I'm going to start to add in and see how we can build a more resilient mover.
Yeah, actually, I'm very similar to both of you guys with a lot of stuff you said. Tyler, your comment about starting stuff earlier in the off season is interesting because we're actually coming towards the end of our first winter phase, and then we'll have spring break, and then we have about a week or two before they start spring ball. So like we're 4 weeks removed from them starting spring ball already. And at this time of year, I think a lot of programs, they're very much in the perfect movement practice time of year. And they're looking for things to look very clean and neat. And I would say we're the exact opposite of that right now. We're probably the messiest time right now. Because like they've got to play football in a few weeks. And like Michael pointed out, that kind of idea of using pads and stuff like that is a great point, because it is different. And so as a prep coach, my feeling is, well, geez, we can't have them go play football and we've not done anything representative. So I would say right now things are a little bit messier than most programs. But as far as like stuff we've added and done, it's very similar to what you guys just said. Maybe some things that I've done that weren't mentioned were like forcing the offensive player or the guy who's trying to elude, making him catch a ball or do something with a ball first. So most people know like chaser drills, okay? Rather than having them start off the other player or start off a auditory cue or something like that, they'll get the ball tossed to them. So the offensive player's got to catch the ball, put the ball away, and then perform their movements. And then the defensive player still then reacts off of that. So just adding that little bit, and I think Michael was kind of the one that turned me on to that with how that might just change things. I think you talked about or shared some ACL research where a lot of ACL injuries happen when you catch a ball and then try to do something. So we've added some of that in, and we'll do the same when we're maybe doing some more change of direction agility type stuff, where kind of similar to what Michael said with the screen passes, they'll get that ball and probably have to still be moving when they catch it. And then the defensive player will have to track them down and either two-hand touch or I think I got this from Shawn, the stay in the bubble concept, where they won't have to touch them, but they'll have to get within a 2-yard bubble and try to stay with them as they move across the drill. Maybe they have to go downfield 10 yards or 15 yards. The defensive player will have to I tell them, get in the bubble and stay in the bubble. So that's kind of something we're working in. Other stuff, like you guys mentioned, adding more people into the activity. And one thing that I'm going to do this year that we haven't done in years past is add obstacles and obstructions. So maybe we'll do a few reps with nothing in let's say we've got like a 10 by 10 yard box or a 15 by 15 yard box. Offensive player's got to get across the box without being touched. Defensive player has to touch him. Then we might add in some either I haven't decided yet if I want to do actual people just in the drill that they have to work around, or if I want to use something like plyo boxes or hurdles, just something that they have to actually work around and either use as for their advantage, or the defensive players got to figure out how to navigate around those obstacles.
Korey, question for you real quick there. Love what you're adding. And I think on the last one, the question I would ask would be, while I still feel and have done in the past myself, like adding in layers of obstruction to see how that's going to change the behavioral dynamics. From a representative standpoint, specifically if you're in a situation where you guys are messier and you get ready and you have to go into playing football for spring ball, do you feel it would be more advantageous for the learner to have people there, whether they're moving or not moving, or at least hopefully moving a little bit, to create that versus it being an abstract object, simply because the information that's present is going to be then different than how the movements are going to be? That would just be the question I would have with you. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a person would probably be a little bit better, but just my hesitation is just a group of 50 college-aged football players. Just like, you know what? Just So, but no, I think that having people there, and then they can move too. Yeah. Maybe we do a couple reps where they're not moving; they're truly just stationary. But then a few reps where those obstructions are actually moving, then the problem is ever changing, just like it would be on a football field.
Yeah, then the movements are emergent in that type of situation. I love it. Yeah.
So I'd say those are the main things.
Nice, I like it. And I also enjoy the fact that I just sat here for 25 minutes and took 2 pages worth of notes from what you guys were saying. So I appreciate you guys sharing your knowledge and locking arms and learning there. with me, because it also, ironically enough, and this should come as no surprise or shock, I could see so much reflection of some of my similar ideas or thoughts as each one of you three were sharing. And it just gave me additional ideas to add into that, what I always want to do for my respective players, which is design a learning environment which facilitates a complex problem to interact with the performer, of course, and my players. A number of you, I think actually all three of you mentioned in one way, shape, or form the article that I put out at the end of our off season in 2018, which highlighted some of the changes that I made last year, which were all oriented around the 2018 theme for my players and myself, which was adaptability within adaptability. And as each one of you guys talked, that was like really the first thing that popped out to me. That was like this big alarm or siren going off as all three of you guys were talking, that most of the things that you guys are doing are aiming at trying to enhance the adaptability within the adaptability of that athlete's movement skill. The ability to not necessarily look for an idealized movement pattern or an idealized movement solution, but more specifically to create an athlete who concomitantly can read or recognize and truly perceive and detect what the problem is affording them, and learning how to interact with that respective problem in more efficacious ways. So I just sat here beaming as each one of you guys talked, because many of the things that you guys mentioned were things that not only I had in mind also this year as well, but also things that I've tried in the past. Michael, as you were talking specifically in regards to the helmets and pads issue, 2 years ago in 2017, I had players do the same, specifically oriented around the helmet, in the perceptual qualities or the way that things change once you put something on your head. It changes the perceptual capabilities, but if it changes the perceptual capabilities, we also know that it changes the cognitive or intentional capabilities or affordances, and then most of all, it changes the movement actions that could potentially be available to us or that might emerge. So I think that idea right there was so money. Another thing that you said, Michael, in there in regards to the down and distance, I think is so key to driving intentions. And trying to give us a true aim to act in a given way. I look back at that Saquon Barkley Mover of the Year analysis that I did, and many of the weaknesses, specifically in regards to his degrees of freedom perceptually and how he's attaching or connecting to the respective affordances, the invitations that he may not be accepting, I think is often driven from him not necessarily connecting or fitting along with the intention that goes along with down and distance. You know, if he needs to pick up 4 and he has an avenue or a gap in order to pick up 5 or 6, he has to start to take that play or connect to those affordances, as opposed to looking to break it big to the outside in a play that, you know, is high risk but high reward. That's sort of what we see from even the most masterful or most skillful and dexterous mover, I believe, in the National Football League today, in Saquon Barkley. And so some of those things drive key perceptions and intentions. And I think we can't undervalue what role that might have if a player continually gets exposed to those respective problem constraints. Tyler, as you were talking, one thing that really kind of hit home to me was that whole idea of constraining to afford. So opening up a wider range of movement problems for the individual to go seek and search what affordances exist for them, but it has to take place through really representative ways to where we can allow multiple decisions to be made, or I should say more variable problems to be solved. And so that kind of brings me to one of the things that I'm going to try to do this year. Everybody knows that I hold repetition without repetition really near and dear to my heart. But one thing I'm going to aim to do this year more than I have in any other year is form a wider range of affordance landscape, specifically a wider range of problems, repetition to repetition, but also repetition within repetition. And what I mean by that is giving them a wider range of affordances to interact with, different openings and different invitations within the same problem that they might face rep to rep. And so just by changing some of those interactions, specifically when we have 2v2 or 2v4 or 2v3, whatever it might be, right? To get some of those shared affordances existing, I think are so key and vital to us actually creating a more resilient and a more bulletproof movement system, a movement system that has more abundance within its movement toolbox. And again, sort of on that same token or note, I then take something that Korey said there, specifically in regards to the obstacles and obstructions. 2 years ago, I had a skill player. In fact, he was in college at the time, and you guys know him, Nick Holly. So he was really sort of crafty with the way that he creates movement solutions. And he's not currently on an NFL roster, but he was with the Rams in the throughout the course of 2018, was picked up after the draft and then spent time there throughout training camp. And he has NFL level movement skill and quality, especially in the open field with a ball in his hands. And we would often find him 2 years ago on the college field utilizing the ref in the middle of the field in order to use it as his advantage. So Korey, when you were talking about that obstacle or obstruction, it can be an obstacle and obstruction for both parties, right? The offensive or defensive player. And that person might not necessarily have to move. You know, some of the refs, specifically the ones that are in the field itself, in the field of play, can be utilized as another affordance. You could actually accept that as an invitation to use that person to block off a safety or a backer that's moving in space. And I know that you mentioned that you didn't necessarily want to have a bunch of 50 college kids, you know, in the middle of that field just because of liability and negligence. That's where, as a sport movement skill specialist, you have to put on that referee hat and get yourself in the middle of the field and put in your perspective.
And I'm definitely worried.
Because I can tell you, after having done that for the last 2 years, because once I saw Nick doing that more frequently, it was like this light bulb moment for me where I was like, Shawn, you dumbass. Like, why haven't you actually placed yourself in that position with no intention to move, but an intention to see things in a different way, but also create another obstacle for the players themselves to go solve?
Shawn,
So
do you mind?
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you mind if I add something there real quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the biggest things that I think we've all said, but you just said just then, so I wanted to, for the listeners out there, that is so crucial, is that we all perceive different affordances. And so just because us as the coach or the coaches out there may not think of it, that's why I feel like it's so vital, which we're all doing. It sounds like it's so vital to actually involve that learner into the learning system or the learning context, because of the fact that you didn't perceive it at that particular time. You know, there's certainly times where I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think about that. But it was something that someone else, whether it's another coach or another person, had mentioned. So like affordances are perceived different by different individuals at different times, and they happen very rapidly and decay very rapidly.
Well, and we have to allow that to exist within our practice environment as well. So in that whole constraining to afford idea, we don't want to attempt too many constraint manipulations, specifically in regards to opponent behaviors or specifically in regards to the potential landscape of affordances, because we want to allow that player to search that landscape of affordances, or more specifically, what aspects within that movement problem, what represents the locks that they believe they have a key for, you know, or what they want to go exploit within that movement problem. And what we're going to find, Tyler, much as like what you mentioned, is every player looks to exploit different aspects of that information that they're interacting with, because they may not be interacting with that problem in the same way as another performer. Again, affordances or the problem or the information is all subject or individual as well as frame dependent. And I think that becomes a really key piece of information for us to kind of remember there. The other thing that was really popping out to me, Michael, I know you had made the mention in regards to defensive players with balls in their hands. In order to look to scoop and score type of opportunities, or once a defensive player picks off a ball, oftentimes in practice, everything stops. You know, the offensive players are pissed off, so they're walking back to the sideline, they got their heads down. But that's not stopping when it's an NFL Sunday or a college football Saturday or a high school football Friday night, right? So to continue to ingrain sort of that constant adaptability within that respective problem, even when stuff goes wrong, even when shit happens the way that it's not supposed to, forcing and requiring your athletes to get in that mode of adaptability at all times so they can also remain attuned to what that respective peculiar problem is requiring based on its emergence as well. So we see the solver interacting truly with that peculiar, unique, organic problem each and every time. I try to create as much of that as I possibly can. So, even in 2018, when we took that adaptability within adaptability type of mindset, I did a lot with defensive players with the balls in their hands. I also did a lot of defensive player to offensive player changing roles. And I know we've talked about that a little bit in the past. It's something that I'm still kind of playing around with for 2019 and where it fits. But I believe that it's one of those things that we cannot neglect. We often have offensive players where as soon as you put them on the defensive side of the ball or in a defensive frame of mind, they don't even know perceptually or cognitively how to connect to that respective problem. And then it is no shock or surprise when a defensive player does pick off the ball. Oftentimes it ends up in a pick six or with a big time return when that player doesn't necessarily have that overly skilled attunement to necessarily carrying a ball in their hands. Maybe they haven't carried a ball in their hands since college or high school, but what you see is the changing intention of the offensive player who now has to become defensive minded. You see that they're back on their heels. They don't know how to read or recognize. Their head is on a swivel. They're like, where the hell am I? I don't know where I am in time and space, and I don't even have any intention of tackling that guy to the ground. I cannot stand when I see any of my offensive players kind of get in that frame of mind because they look like a fish out of water. But it's no fault to theirs if we haven't taken the time to develop it. And so that's another one of those things that I just spent a lot of time doing in 2017 and 2018, and I want to continue to do in 2019. The other thing that really pops out to me off of some of the things that you guys said that I will take an extension of, within that repetition without repetition and trying to really facilitate this adaptability mode or mindset is allowing more complexity even when the messiness is going to be there. Oftentimes coaches, as we've talked about on this podcast before, are control freaks, they're progression freaks, and therefore we don't necessarily aim for that messiness, but we don't know what is sticking around in that movement toolbox or in the control and coordination of those respective solutions until we test it with things like complexity or obstacles or threats to a certain degree. And I'm not saying get dangerous, but you have to have a certain amount of threat, because the last time I checked, playing again on a Sunday, Saturday, or Friday night has quite a bit of threat to it. And until you allow that player to embrace that discomfort that comes with that, you can't really test the movement skill all that well. Again, I'm not saying that in the practice setting, in our, whether it's strength and conditioning or a movement coach or performance enhancement specialist or anything like that, that we should be looking to ear hole guys and things like that. But what I am saying, we should look to get pressure and anxiety in the form of threat. By a changing problem to see how that individual is really ready to adapt. And then another thing that I will say there in regards to that complexity is just try to see what makes your athletes more uncomfortable within those respective interactions. And that will give us some insight on maybe where we should probably aim to spend more time, because that's our athlete essentially telling us, their athlete's movement system rather, telling us where their challenge point currently exists. And I now aim to spend more time there. Even right now, we're in mid-February, and we just started to introduce representative learning last week, a little bit towards the tail end of the week. And this week, we'll start hitting more on the field. Prior to this point in the last 3 or 4 weeks, for my guys who came back early, we've been doing a little bit more novel or general type of movement tasks. So we've been doing more of our movement, animal flow type work. We've just been kind of like wiping some things clean and clear and kind of getting their frame of mind around where it needs to be. We haven't actually gotten on to our theme for 2019 yet, which we collectively together, myself as well as my collection of players for this respective year, will kind of connect to. So when we come up with adaptability within adaptability, that's not something necessarily that I come up with. It's something that I'm maybe trying to shape or guide or facilitate them to think around. But then they come up with our cliche quote. And we haven't gotten to that point yet. But my point with this is this. You mentioned earlier, Tyler, about doing that representative learning earlier. I'm doing that a little bit more as well. Typically mid-February is when I would introduce it. This year I'm doing it exactly at that time. But my players now, especially the ones who've been with me for a more significant period of time, are asking for more messiness early on. Like, it's not me telling them we're going to get messier. It's them actually asking for it because they understand what it means to their comfort within the movement problems they face come April and come May when they get back with their teams. And Korey, to kind of speak to your point about that messiness when they're going to spring ball, like the player can feel and understand a different level of coordination and control interacting with those problems in those integrative ways once they've been exposed to those more representative tasks. And that's what I'm finding from players. So they're asking for more representative learning because they know what it means for their movement solutions. And so I think that just becomes another interesting piece of the pie there that you guys all hit on, that I think those listeners out there who maybe haven't played around with a whole lot of these concepts think that their players will want to run away from the messiness. They will want to run away from the mistakes. And oftentimes it's the coach that wants to run away from the messiness or mistakes. Mm-hmm. And they don't understand that messiness and those mistakes are actually where the individual is searching in attempting to discover and ultimately trying to exploit the problems that they typically face on field. And in order to get that player to exist there, we have to push them to that challenge point where they lose grip, as Danny Newcomb would say. They lose grip on their movement solutions and how that interacts. And then the final thing I'll say there, and then I'll shut up and let you guys jump on with anything that you want to, is no one really mentioned repetition without repetition within the weight room. You guys all sort of saw my session last year in that way when you guys came on the 4th of July, I think it was, or maybe it was that week anyway. And that was something that I did a lot more in 2018, and I'm attempting to do even more in 2019. So giving the player more ownership, giving them more options, but also on that same token or note, aiming for more repetition without repetition, our same learning model in the weight room on the majority of time than I typically would. And now I can probably do that more than most can because we're talking about NFL players here, and they obviously have tapped out many of those generalized motor abilities, right? They've tapped out some of those really, strength, speed, power, all of those things aren't necessarily what's going to get us greater transfer. They have to have adequate amounts of them, but oftentimes our performance enhancement on field isn't necessarily going to come from those things. So I've taken and adopted a learner model much in the same way I have on field in the weight room. So no two reps oftentimes set to set look the same, as you guys saw and knew. So I just want to make that mention as well. I know that we all covered quite a few topics here, and we could go down any different numbers at this point.
Sean, can you just describe that, what that might look like then? I know maybe it was like last year, I think we were there. Rhett was doing I think reverse lunge, just a lunge variations. And so describe maybe in say you programmed a lunge or it was a dumbbell incline bench, I believe was another one, how that rep without rep would look in those two exercises, just for our listeners to have some clarity.
Absolutely. And for me, I started to look at it as an interaction with the information about what their body is essentially telling them and what they want to go explore, just like we would out on the field. So the way that I will do that is essentially shape the augmented information that I'm giving them, the supplemental information that I'm giving them leading up to the task. And so if it's that reverse lunge, or it's not even a reverse lunge, Michael, what it was with Rhett, it was just lunge pattern. So I told him at that point, we were going to do a lunge pattern, and the only constraint that I gave him was I didn't want any two reps. I think, whatever rep scheme it was, maybe it was, 6 on each side, 8 on each side, 10 on each side. The rep scheme isn't important. Neither is the set scheme. What was important is I told should look the same. And I want you to explore whatever positions and pattern within the lunge that you desire to on this day. Boom, point, period, blank. That's what I gave him. And what you saw emerge then was his sort of search, him seeking what felt good, what felt, maybe it wasn't even what felt good, maybe what lacked control. And you give the ownership in the the authenticity over to the individual. You give that, once you give that ownership there, the player will start to explore and start to tell you almost like where they feel uncomfortable just simply from their exploration. So you might have saw Rhett going at one angle, maybe he's at this shin angle, maybe he's changing his trunk position. All of those things start to change because the only constraint I gave him from an information standpoint, augmented information, was for him to go and execute in a repetition without repetition fashion. That no 2 reps should look the same. And so to him, that meant no 2 reps would really feel the same, but he had full permission to go explore. So I gave him the keys to the car, and he could essentially go at any angle that he wanted to. You might find this is sort of like a movement screen in and of itself for your athletes. You will see how they feel on that day, what they're comfortable with. Maybe not, it's not even on that day. You can start to have dialogue around that. Like, I see you avoiding this position on this leg. Is there a reason for that? Do you know that you're doing that? And that creates a little bit more dialogue springboard for you as a sport movement skill specialist to say, hey, this could potentially even be transferring to when you have to behave more sub or unconsciously in the problems that you're facing on field. And you will start to be able to see certain affordances for action show themselves on field based on what you're seeing in the weight room. And it isn't that they're staying in this tight little container of this is how you perform this lunge with perfect idealized biomechanics, but instead they actually get to make that lunge feel more contextual. And again, some people will say, well, the weight room isn't used for that. The weight room is used for power development and strength characteristics and stability and so on and so forth, right? And I get that. And I'm not saying that there isn't a time and a place for that. But what I'm also saying is that we have to look for strength and conditioning professionals to make that tie-in between the weight room and what's happening in the sport. And that's a way that I believe they can do that. So I don't know if I explained or answered the question there, Michael, as sufficiently as you wanted me to kind of give people what that might look like.
Yeah, I think it was perfect.
Yeah.
Just for the listeners, other ways when we were there at the session was I believe that you told Rhett as well, not only this exploration of the lunge pattern, but I think each set he couldn't carry the same weight. So in one hand, he might have had a 45-pound dumbbell. The other hand might have been a 20. He might have had him at his side one set. He might have had up by his shoulders like a front rack the other set. So not only just the angles and variations, the width, the shin angles, the trunk angles of his movements, but also how he carried the load, what load was in each hand. I thought those were unique ways that you had to rep without rep from not only each repetition, but each set that you required rep to change up certain nuances within that lunge pattern. And also same thing with the dumbbell bench. He had to do different weights, different hands, different angles, different bench angles. So always, I think coaches just listening, if they want to play around with this in a lunge pattern, you could use an elevation, just use a 2-inch block, and also now you're stepping off a block, so there's maybe deeper angles in the hips. Just trying to, like I said, the theme of this episode is maybe application. Here's some application for coaches to maybe experiment or play around with. But Tyler and Korey, I know, Tyler, you had something to say, but
well, yeah, no, go ahead.
But that's how I saw it, and I thought that was a unique way to build, like Shawn said, rep without rep, and contextual in the weight room for his athletes.
No, beautiful. I'm glad you brought that up. One of the biggest things too, and both of you just mentioned it and kind of hit on it there, was, being able to create great rate of force development needs to be done at a variety of different angles and positions. And so whenever it's just standing and doing it in a sagittal plane on a regular basis, yeah, obviously there can be some carryover there. But I think it's something that we should encourage our athletes to start exploring, is the capability to not have the exact same loads on a regular basis, the same positions on a regular basis. And we're still being able to develop strength and being able to develop that power in the weight room, but we're able to do it in different situations. And I think that it also affords the opportunity for the athletes, like Shawn had mentioned, to start to, whether they realize it or not, express some of the positions they may not be as strong in. So that gives us an opportunity, just like we do on the field, whenever we're constantly doing a movements assessment by evaluating how our athletes move. It allows us to be able to see it maybe in a little bit slower manner. It allows us to see that in the weight room as well. And not that I'm utilizing this as a cheap plug for kettlebell training by any means. And obviously that's a skill in and of itself. But one of the biggest things about bell training that I gravitate towards, and one of the reasons I got into it back over a decade ago now, is the fact that you have an extended center of mass that's constrained to rotate around an axis. And so whenever that happens, that's going to cause those obstructions, those perturbations within a normal movement pattern. And so that allows the learner to search for different opportunities to create that force and that power in those positions as well. And for some athletes that have never used it before, obviously, like I just now said, that's a huge skill in and of itself. But at the same time, if it's something that can be added in periodically, I have seen some great benefits, and I know a lot of my athletes can speak to that as well. And that's specifically within creating that variability or that functional fit variability within a weight room.
So I have a question on that, Shawn. Would you do the similar method with like a bilateral exercise? Like what if you're doing like a back squat or a bench press or a press with a barbell, I should say?
Yeah, a great question. Wonderful question, because I think it has a lot of practical application there. I would, Korey, and the way that I would do that is either set by set or rep by rep. I would change the width of the stance or the width of the grip on the bar. I would maybe change certain aspects of tempo and rhythm of the respective execution. So I would even tell players that as far as maybe one rep, you're going to do a slow eccentric. The next rep, you're going to have a fast eccentric followed by a short iso. In the third rep, it's going to be a more of a reactive type of fashion. Something as simple as that creates that differential learning in that repetition without repetition in my mind in the weight room, and it forces the human movement system to attune to what affordances it has, even from a force production, positional control, stability, balance, all of those types of aspects. So now it becomes a little messier, just as it would out on the field. And that's what makes people a little bit apprehensive in order to do it, of course, from a strength and conditioning standpoint, because many people are control freaks in the weight room, because we sit through session after session at this NSCA conference listening about periodization, and I should do this sets and this reps with this exercise variety, and then I move to that exercise variety, and then I progress to this one. Well, I say F that, and I say let the human movement system become more adaptive in figuring these things out, because the athlete will have to be adaptive when the time comes when they're in their sport. So I just think it's a way that we can create a greater conduit between the work that we're doing from a motor ability standpoint, our physical preparation, and really preparing them for the field or for the sport. I'm not saying it's always something to do, but I'm saying it's another tool in the toolbox that I believe that strength and conditioning professionals could really do themselves a service of playing with.
Yep, agreed completely. And for those listeners out there, I'm sure there's plenty since Korey's on the podcast, and why wouldn't they be? For all the listeners out there that'll be attending the Northwestern College clinic coming up in early May, while my session guiding skill adaptation will be predominantly about on-field performance, we'll be tackling some of these concepts and topics as well. So hopefully they'll get a chance to hear that at a second time, because I think there's so much value in what was mentioned right there, Shawn, and those concepts can start to be nudged a little bit and allowing people to interact with different things in the weight room. So I think that's crucial.
Awesome. Go ahead, Korey. Sorry.
I was going to say, get to Orange City on May 4th.
Yeah.
I know at least we'll have 3 of the 4 there. I'll be there. Obviously, Korey and Tyler will be there. Shawn, what's going on?
Well, I have to say, I've been known to spend some time in a car with Tyler before, sometimes going further than I had anticipated when we set out. So who knows? I think there's a good chance and likelihood of it as well, because I always look forward to the opportunity to spend more time with Tyler. I don't know how that happens, but it does.
Yeah, you guys got to get some freaking fire miles in your cars or something like that.
We are drawing heavily
and me getting in trouble with his wife. So let's not let's not forget about that either.
Well, I know we kind of it's a 10 a.m. on a Sunday. I know some of you guys had planned going to church. You guys have a few minutes, or you want to kind of close it at this? I'll leave it up to you guys.
Yeah, I could probably go another 15 or so.
Likewise.
Sweet. I don't know where we want to go with this. Something that I'll add, and I know we've talked something along these lines before, but something that Tyler talked about as in involving the athletes more, involving their voice and their opinion on some of our activities more often. One thing that I'm doing this year is that we're filming a lot of our on-field sessions. We're filming just about almost everything we do. And then we're going to have, I have weekly, bi-weekly meetings with my athletes where we maybe watch this film or we watch kind of their game film. And it's just like they would during the season, as they have their position meetings or team meetings on the field or with their sport coaches. We're trying to have that as much as possible with us, where I'm trying to, and maybe it's even more for me than for them, where I'm trying to get inside their brains, see why they did things, trying to get them to open up and share. And then we use those meetings, as Tyler said, for our athletes to voice, what can we do to make this activity even more representative? What can we do to improve this activity that, from your eyes, that would make it even better for you, that would transfer or be retained on the field? So we're having these weekly meetings. And I know we've talked, I think it was a previous one or two ago, about watching film. Not only we don't want our athletes to rely on watching themselves. Like you said, Shawn, in the NFL, every player looks up at the replay board. And it's kind of this reliance of watching this video. And I know we don't want to create necessarily that, but I do see value in watching repetitions. And for me as a coach, trying to have them share, what affordances they saw themselves in. Because again, as a coach, it's kind of wrong for us to necessarily say, did you see this? Why did you do that? Without them kind of sharing exactly what they saw, felt during that rep. So trying to use a little bit more of these meetings and watching film for us to kind of interact and have this dialogue into, for them, voicing their opinions of where things can be improved, et cetera. And as a coach, me just trying to gain further insight into their brain and their operations. And so it's actually probably more for me than for them. But doing these weekly meetings and watching film has been a big thing that I'm trying to work on this off season.
Well, I think that's the point you made there, Michael, with you think it's maybe more for you than for them. And I won't lie, I kind of feel the same way sometimes. But at the same time, because of the fact that we're a learning system together and that the interaction and the dynamic interaction between the two is so vital for helping with that guided discovery of learning, even if it is more for us sometimes than it is for them. And I know that it's, on the opposite side sometimes too, but even if it is, that's okay, because I feel like that allows us to create an even better environment for learning. And when you look at an ecological approach to learning and these different that underpins the CLA and a variety of others, the reason why I feel like it's so dynamic is because the fact these learners start to seek out and they ask for it more, kind of like Shawn had mentioned, they're wanting that learning to become messier because they see how important this can be for their ability to interact with those different affordances that are no different than what they're experiencing on the field. So I think that adding in film and evaluating that film with them and is something that is extremely important and something that I didn't start actually doing again until last year. I had done it some earlier in my career and pulled away from it. I think I had mentioned that on a podcast before, but I realized how much that is needed. And I don't think it needs to be with just the higher level performers. I think it can be allowing us to have more of that education of attention to certain things in the environment, and then that education of intention as well. So I think that's awesome.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because even from what we know about motivation, that just adds autonomy, right? Like, we benefit from learning more and creating better activities, but then the athlete gets a sense of ownership and control in the process of their training. And so it's a double win. So yeah, good stuff.
Yeah, and on that same token or note, most of you guys probably know that at least in the summer, at least for the 5.5 week period of time that they're back with me between mini camp and training camp, I record literally every single rep of our representative learning. It isn't even so much always for them, like you guys mentioned, but it is much for me. But it allows me to kind of see things, hopefully through their movement lens a little bit more, through their movement systems lens of perception, intentions, and actions, and try to get an idea on maybe what I have to do from a learning designer to shape or manipulate the constraints of the problem, so the problem will act in different ways, so the individual can interact in those ways that maybe would become more efficacious, or that maybe would push them to their challenge point. But to speak to your point, Michael, I think it is so important And I think too often that we do not do this in regards to really trying to get the athletes' dialogue and to understand, the whole quote that I used on the Stuart Armstrong Talent Equation podcast a number of weeks ago was, how is that movement problem talking to you? And what is the problem saying to you? And I don't mean that literally as far as auditory type of what is it saying, but what is speaking to you here within this problem? Because the similar acting problem is going to speak to each performer differently. And that information that I can get from that player in regards to their perceptual degrees of freedom and their perceptual variability will start to tell me inter-individual differences in their affordances for action. What openings and invitations they are actually able to even to connect to. What do they see? What is guiding their movement system to formulate and compose the solution that it is vital to me as a sport movement skill specialist if I'm ever going to help facilitate a more enhanced, more functional fit between their movement system and the problems that they face. So I think that video is a way to do that. And the one thing I will say with that video, after having done that, I think this is it's got to be year 5 or 6 of me literally recording. I have an intern who literally is at every session almost. Last year I had Tyler recording me in one of them, so he got to see that firsthand, at least my safety skills.
I was going to say, it's funny because I was out there for about the previous 3 hours with 2 different athletes that I had, and Shawn had come in and started to set up for one of his sessions, and he saw about half an hour one of my sessions. And I was only planning to hang around for about 30 minutes. And next thing you know, I was there for about 3 hours. And I may have been roped into filming a little bit too, but that's okay.
that doesn't sound like Shawn.
Yeah. No, not at all.
Yeah.
Shocker. It's a shock.
Yeah, the one thing that I will say with that is you do that, and Tyler did a great job, whether it was intuitive or not, or whether we had talked about it, is you changed positions of that video perspective. So like that, the way that third person view was actually occurring was a different angle and catching different aspects of the degrees of freedom of that human movement system on both ways, both from the offensive and defensive side. Again, we could start to see aspects of perception, cognition, and action sort of at play as it's interacting with the problem that it's facing. So whether you did that intuitively or not, I don't know. But
I'm happy that it was beneficial for everyone because I was doing it selfishly. I was wanting to see from different positions if I was able to perceive something differently than I was from another angle. And for me, it helped out tremendously. So it was certainly selfish. So I'm glad it actually ended up working out for you guys as well.
But I think it definitely bears repeating for those listeners out there who might be looking to apply this idea from an observational learning standpoint for themselves with their own analytical lens, but also then for their athletes. So their athletes don't get dependent on seeing it a certain way. And almost like when they picture themselves moving, they don't always see it from these specific angles. I think that's part of the dependency. Michael, you mentioned, and they're not wanting our athletes or allowing our athletes to ever become reliant or dependent on the video to understand how that movement problem is talking to them. I kind of got into that at the beginning when my players would go back and watch the video every single rep almost in the rest period. And then all of a sudden I started to realize how dependent they were becoming on it. And I think that's important, an important piece to not miss as well, that they shouldn't have to say, well, I got to see the rep to see what happened. We don't want that to happen. We want them to hold it. And then the other side of it that I will make a mention here that hopefully will be short-winded is that oftentimes the athlete may not know or be able to recall how that movement problem was talking to them. So all of a sudden, if they see it over again, it can be beneficial. As at that Barry Sanders video that I tweeted not that long ago, just a few days ago, where he said, I had to turn my brain off at certain times and just attempt to react. So his intention, as he stated, was simply to make people miss. He wanted to perfect the art of making people miss. So he would be asked afterwards in regards to what happened, and he would have really no recognition or recall of what happened because of where he was holding and how he was intending to move and where his perception was being guided from at that moment, based on what he was going into the problem with. And I think we have to sort of respect every movement problem solver as well for who they are in addition to that. You know, like I have some running backs who think that way, and then I have other running backs who literally are cerebral and can be like, I saw him sit this way, so I went that way, or I got him to do a head fake here, so I, you know, like I put him on a string there, and they can articulate in that way. I don't need every mover to do it that way, but we can learn something from each mover and how they authentically, individually do it, I guess is my point.
Yeah.
All right. So one last thing, and something that I saw some of my athletes have trouble with this year, and maybe it's a private sector thing. And I know, Shawn, you obviously are in contact with your athletes all year long to a much greater extent than I am. And Korey and Tyler, you guys can speak to this too, because Korey, you're not at every away game and things like this. But one of the, I guess, the faults or the cons of, say, working as I do in the private sector is, you know, we'll have a whole off season with my athletes, and then they're oftentimes gone to their sport team, or our contact is limited. Mm-hmm. And one of the conversations that multiple times have popped up in our conversations with my athletes before we started was they just kind of fell off on some of the things that we used to do all the time, whether they got lazy or they just ran out of time. And so trying to, you know, kind of put together these kind of, I'm calling them the dailies. So these daily tasks or activities that we're going to try to build in almost every single day, that I'd like them to have them do that when they're away from me with their sport teams, with on their campus, whatever it may be, where they are doing these activities on a daily basis so they don't fall off on forgetting or losing some of these skill sets that we work so hard on. And it's just something that obviously, like I said, being in the private sector, my athletes are often with me for 3 to 6 months, and then I don't see them again. And they're far away, and I can text them and call them and all that kind of stuff, but I'm not there in a hands-on type of environment where we are updating and continuing to improve some of these skill sets and these things that we're working on from a distance. And so I'm trying to come up with each athlete having these kind of individual daily activities that I want them to do when they're away from me, so they don't lose or become lazy on these things that we work so hard to continue to adapt to and attune to during this off season. And then when they're away from me, it just goes to hell. But I know, Shawn, in your warm up, you've talked about, you give your athletes this kind of this listed or this warm up that they want them to do, and you're oftentimes the first one at a training camp practice or a game, and it's your athlete out there, you know, an hour and a half before the game, and they're going through this kind of this daily activity checklist that you kind of work with them so they don't lose some of these things that you guys work so hard to you know, adapt to and attain to during this off season.
Yeah, and that's a great point. That was essentially my solution. Goodness gracious, probably 8 to 9 years ago, my solution to the problem that you just mentioned in regards to losing touch with that athlete. I now have a little bit more intimate relationship, a little even with my remote guys, of course, simply because that's how I've structured my niche with what I do in my role with them. But on that same token, Michael, it's still a problem that arises at times because the players get really busy obviously during the season. So my movement prep, at least for them, are their individualized movement prep, and what we had gotten them accustomed to really like owning the behaviors within that became my way to ensure that as long as they were doing that each and every day, they were sort of tapping things out at least to a minimum level. That being said, this last year, when we took that adaptability within adaptability type of mindset, if you guys will remember, to my end of the year blog in 2018, my end of the training blog, we added more repetition without repetition to our movement preps. So what we did there is we started to change orders, and we started to change activities day to day. They still had sort of their base level menu to select from, but I had them not do any 2 movement preps 2 days in a row. So it became a reflection more of that, which what we typically would do during the year in our bigger, more global macro movement sessions, but they got to explore repetition without repetition daily because they get to be creatures of habit. Most athletes in all sports, the National Football League is no different. They go out there, they go through the motions, they go to their position group, they do the exact same drills, they go in the exact same order. And I just tried to engage them perceptually cognitively, and then biomechanically a little bit more and inject a little bit more variability into those movement preps this past year than I have in previous years. And we're going to do that even more. So to kind of speak to that point, that became their daily exploration. We did more exploratory behavior in there. So like on my teams that have multiple guys on it, or even in my teams or my players that have no one else who trains with me on their respective roster, they would just find a staff member to do some open environment, some light open environment stuff day to day based on what we did. And that person could be relatively stationary. They could be slowly moving. It doesn't have to be overly representative, but just to continually give them the keys to the car and work on some of the similar things from an education of attention, an education of intention, and a calibration standpoint, each and every day to keep that direct learning going and to keep adding more to that movement toolbox. So I think those daily behaviors, however someone would want to do them, I think can be highly valuable in whatever, population we're working with.
Yeah. To add, I love that. And to add to that, the way in which I've allowed my athletes to continue a lot of this work that we have done to make sure that they're going to be attuned to that information that they need to be within games. And obviously it's ever changing. Michael, one thing that I mentioned early on was starting the representative tasks earlier in the off season. And one of the reasons for that was I didn't feel like they'd been exposed to as much, and I wanted it to carry over, hopefully as long as possible. And then as we continue to spread a movement like this, hopefully there are more people utilizing these training concepts. That way we're not in this situation where we have to worry about it as much. And then another way that my exploration within the warm-up specifically, and then just being adaptable actually came about was something that you guys may have heard other people refer to as this horse and pony show of, and I hate to even almost bring it up, at the NFL Combine. 3 years ago, one of my athletes was at the Combine, and they had been told that there was going to be a chance they may not know where they're going to be going next. And they may not know exactly how long they have to warm up. So what we started at that time, and I've continued it since then with all of my athletes, is them owning their warm-up and owning the exploration within their particular movements. But it started because of the fact that they didn't know exactly what was going to come next, and that started 3 years ago. The other way that I do it now, Michael, to answer your question, the other way I do it now is I have a monthly at minimum. I try to do it every 2 weeks, but time does get by on this. But a monthly connect on either via Skype, FaceTime, Facebook Messenger, whatever it may be, with all of my athletes that are afar. And then on a weekly basis, I am connecting with them via messaging. And actually, it's funny enough, Shawn and I haven't talked about this, but one of the things he just mentioned is I send them a lot of to-dos or the dailies that kind of like you had mentioned. And mine may not be specifically daily, more it is like this is kind of going to be part of your program. And to find somebody, I have an athlete right now out in California. His brother is part of his movement problem for him. And so while I'm not there to facilitate or guide the learning, that's the reason why that ownership for the athlete to have an understanding of what they're doing is going to be extremely important. And I've got an athlete out in Montana that sends me daily, he actually sends me almost daily checkups of this is what we're doing right now. How else can I add variability to this? So it's more just that communication channel that we have. It's where they don't rely on me per se, but at the same time, they know that I'm reachable and that we can start to help shape and mold some of these learning strategies a little bit different, because the fact of the matter is this is still relatively new. And while it's growing because it's extremely valuable to the learners, we have to be there and be available for them. So the ways in which, those are the ways that I'm doing it currently.
So I guess, well, I won't really add any more to that because I know we're going to wrap up here, but I guess just something to think about for the future with stuff like this, because I know what's running through, and you guys probably do too, any team sport coach who's listening to this, is how do I do that when I've got 125 football players?
Mm-hmm.
Like right now I've got about 80, and I'm going to have 45 to 50 incoming freshmen. When they're not there for the summer, like how do we implement this kind of stuff? So I guess don't have to answer it today, but maybe just on a future podcast or something to think about. That's, I know the challenge with something like that with more the collegiate team side. So I'll just kind of throw that out there as we wrap up.
That's a good question to move forward with. I think maybe next time we discuss. I think that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, and even then, it'll be a great question for those, once the NFL kind of gets off their ass and takes some change and makes some change and tries to get an NFL movement skill acquisition coach on all 32 teams, because the players are going to go somewhere else and they might be doing stuff like, agility ladders and stuff like that, and stuff that they shouldn't be doing. So hopefully once they start doing more representative learning on their respective rosters and on their teams, when that time comes, not if that time comes, when that time comes across the team setting in professional sports, I think it will also be a vital question to ask. So, I think your money there as far as that idea is concerned, Korey.
Well, wonderful, guys. Thanks a lot for hopping on here on an early Sunday morning. As always, great conversation. Just thankful for you guys' kind of friendship and mentorship during this whole movement process, and another awesome episode, I think, for our listeners.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
Thanks for having us on, Michael. Greatly appreciated. I echo everything you just now said, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, guys. Have a great Sunday.
All right. See you, fellas.